Welcome back to KNH 214. This is Module 1, Lecture 2. And we ended Lecture 1 with this idea of eudaimonia as a flourishing state of the soul. We contrasted eudaimonic well-being with hedonic well-being and subjective well-being. And we ended with Aristotle. So eudaimonic well-being is this idea of eudaimonia. Appears to be more focused on a process for experiencing optimal life functioning that is sustainable over a long period of time. So this really gets into the idea of meaning and purpose. And I have a questionnaire here in front of me in terms of how items, that would be used to measure eudaimonic well-being. Things like, I believe I have discovered who I really am. I can say that I've found my purpose in life. I believe it is important to know how what I'm doing fits with purposes worth pursuing. So you can see how, and lastly, I am confused about what my talents really are, which is a flip-flop of eudaimonic well-being. So just some ideas about eudaimonic well-being, how it's measured, what it relates to. We really get into this idea of well-being when it gets into, certainly for our purposes in terms of global well-being, right? Cultural similarities and differences of well-being. And there are a few, even in our own country, in terms of tracing the history of happiness or well-being back in time. In the US, for example, pre-World War II, happiness was viewed pretty much as good fortune and luck, right? So relating more to kind of this external kind of oriented how you're living in the world. Whereas after World War II, happiness became much more of a purely internal state viewed as favorable inner feelings. Now again, I'm not a historian, but you can get in the idea of what happened in World War II, how we came out on top, so to speak, although no one probably really comes out on top in a war of any kind, but you get the idea. So there was even a shift within the US, and then in contrasting happiness, for example, with a place like China, happiness is kind of supposed to be this calm, peaceful feeling, as compared to the US, where people view it as kind of a high activation, positive emotion. So well-being, happiness, pretty much looked at differently within different cultures, and even with our own culture, it has changed over time, which makes it, again, a complex construct to study, but important. Now they get into this idea, typically they find that North Americans are happier than East Asians. And be very careful about when you start reading surveys and so forth about differences in happiness or well-being among countries. And we'll get into this when we get into Module 3 on getting you into the data on some of these surveys, both in the US and internationally. But basically what happens is in America or in the US, we may inflate our happiness. So we're supposed to be happy. So we say we're supposed to be happy, then we say we are. So to be unhappy is kind of un-American, right? We may not actually be happier than East Asians in actuality, but we just say we're happy because that's the way we're supposed to feel. So in America, in the US, you're expected to be happy. It's part of our culture. But so we fake it, so to speak. And we may not be, it may not be how we actually feel. And this is interesting if you look at some of the data coming out on anxiety and depression. I mean, the numbers keep ratcheting up. They keep going up. So if, in fact, we're so happy, why are we getting these higher numbers and percentages of people with anxiety and depression? So it just kind of makes you wonder. So my job in this course partly is to really introduce you to some of these conundrums of happiness and well-being. A lot of it relates to how cultures view it differently. So members of East Asian cultures may underestimate their happiness because in their culture, it's not really appropriate to focus on the self. Where in our culture, it's very appropriate to focus on the self. So East Asians may downplay success or happiness when they're asked. So the meaning of happiness differs across cultures, so that could explain why Americans seem happier. You got language barriers when you go in and measure these constructs and so forth, but there's lots of work done on them, but just cautious in terms of understanding and interpreting results. Americans may seem happier, but they might not actually be happier based on cultural differences. So in the West, basically, we tend to seek happiness by striving for and attaining personal goals, right? That's very important. Set your goals, go after them. Whereas in the East, they seek happiness by preserving social harmony. Don't break up the social group, right? Be harmonious. So asking how happy you are to people in different cultures doesn't always take into consideration the cultural complexity of this concept. And you'll be doing some readings and doing some activities where I hope you really get to appreciate the differences in how people live their lives, whereas happiness is important in different cultures, but it may be perceived and experienced differently. So I'll end with an example in terms of why well-being is so relevant, and I'll get into this area of health, which is an area that I'm very intrigued with and been doing some research and reading and studying and writing on this over the last probably 8 to 10 years. So early on, Riff and Singer, back in the late 90s, they kind of came out with this article, and it said basically individuals with positive purpose are likely to sustain practice of taking care of themselves. So you're not going to be healthy or approach healthy living unless you really kind of feel like it's worth it, that you have a purpose and that you have a meaning in your life. So that's a very significant connection that hasn't really been looked at until recently in terms of looking at this eudaimonic well-being and how healthy people are. The reason this becomes important, and again, this isn't a course on health, but we have a section in Module 1 on well-being and health. If you look at all the data, and again, you can go find anything in newspapers or peer-reviewed articles, whatever it is, the trends seem to be on the downswing in terms of our health. Rise in blood pressure, people don't exercise, we really don't eat the way the experts say we should. So lots of different things going on there in terms of our health and healthy living. Sleep problems, we sleep less, have sex less often than 5 years ago. Stress, billions of dollars. So we seem to be trending towards this unhealthy way of living, which kind of relates to some of the data on anxiety and depression. So we kind of go against this idea that Americans are all, happy. Even getting into, young adults, teenagers, emerging adults, same thing in terms of looking at the data. Again, you've got these PowerPoints, you can look at these more carefully if you want, but I give you the big picture here in terms of even in teens, their health seems to be on the downswing in terms of some health behaviors. High percentages don't, follow guidelines. They watch a lot of TV or work on their computers, iPads, phones, whatever it might be. So that's just kind of the picture. I'm not trying to be too negative, but I'm just presenting the data in terms of health behaviors. Now, go back to level 3, right, or era 3. You had era 1, communicable disease, eradicating those, then chronic disease, hopefully eradicating those, and now we're moving into this producing optimal health for all. We're hopefully entering this age of well-being. If that's true, then we should begin to be positively impacting health behaviors if you buy that Riff and Singer quote back when in terms of positive purpose is connected to our health behaviors. Well-being could be at the core of this third health revolution. I'm giving you kind of my take on this now in terms of well-being being a resource for everyday life. So era 3, hopefully we're moving into that era. It kind of came out of positive psychology and the positive youth development movements. A study by Riff et al. You will do this reading as well. I believe it's reading number 7. You can look at it. Probably certainly a question on the quiz about it, but basically they looked at the eudaimonic well-being of older women and found that those who scored high had better sleep, better immune functioning, lower cardiovascular risk. So this idea of how we feel about ourselves is connected to what we do in terms of health behaviors. That's a connection that hasn't really been looked at until recently. Other studies, health impact of eudaimonia. It's associated with how good we sleep. Even in Japan, Japanese who had this sense of eudaimonia, what they call ikigai, had a diminished risk of cardiovascular-related death over 11 years. So again, why I wake up in the morning? That relates to eudaimonic well-being. Even with physical activity, some of our own work, we've found that when we help employees at Miami University in a study we did with their eudaimonic well-being, they walked more. They became more physically active, as this study, which has been recently published, shows. So what we found was that we were able to enhance vitality by going through this process, and that increase in vitality motivated them to walk more. Even with teenagers, we're finding eudaimonic well-being is negatively related to frequency of marijuana use. So the better you feel about yourselves, the less likely you're going to go to marijuana, or inhalants, or prescriptive drug use, or riding with an impaired driver, so on and so forth. And Hoyt et al. Found that eudaimonic well-being was strongly related to less cigarette smoking, less binge drinking, less marijuana use. So good stuff in terms of if people feel good about themselves, they'll be healthier in terms of being attracted to healthier living. A recent study that I did with Dr. Horn, a faculty member here, we found that for teens, freshmen in high school, that when they felt like they felt competent or autonomous and felt vital, they had more positive health behaviors. So basically, trying to really help you look at that well-being is relevant. There's cultural differences, but even in our own country in terms of research, we're finding a strong connection between well-being and health behaviors. So you can't just focus on changing health behaviors by saying, hey, be more active, without taking into consideration the whole person, how they feel about themselves. And this is true in our country and probably other countries as well. So conclusions, basically, the concept of happiness has changed over time in the US, right? It used to be more fortune and luck. Then after World War II, it became much more of an inner experience. Happiness and well-being are similar but different. Happiness probably more aligned with hedonic well-being. Eudaimonic well-being, quite different really from subjective and hedonic well-being. Happiness and well-being experiences differ across different cultures. So you got to be careful. You got to understand language differences. You got to understand how cultures, what they value, and what things mean to people. So just going in and asking how happy people are is kind of a loaded question, so to speak, right? There's lots of kind of tricky waters to navigate there in terms of understanding what you get from those kinds of assessments. And again, this course will kind of allow you to dig in a little bit more on some of that data and how they gather it, what it means, and is it relevant to our daily existence in this country and in other countries. Happiness and well-being seem to be linked to healthy living. Ending with this, basically, again, some of that data, and I know I went through it relatively quickly, but the simple idea is that certainly with even things like subjective well-being, but more importantly, I feel eudaimonic well-being, this idea of being able to express yourself, being able to really feel like you have a purpose and meaning in your life, that is connected to health behaviors. If we keep trying to change behavior without taking that into consideration, hopefully I'm not being too repetitive here, but I want to kind of end to really nail this in terms of if we keep doing that without taking into consideration how we feel about our lives, our chances of being successful in changing these really kind of downward spiral trends, not only for adults but for teens and young adults, we're not going to be very successful. So that's the area that I've been most interested in, but the course is not going to just be about health and healthy living. It's going to be about well-being in a much broader sense in terms of looking at what people are doing in different countries relating to helping people with well-being, what impacts our well-being in this country and other countries, and how do our definitions and our cultures influence how we look at well-being. So hopefully these first two lectures kind of gave a good introduction, and there's some information here that'll be utilized for the quiz as well. Goodbye.